Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts, and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. Well, my friend, it's good to be back with you and getting so close to the end of Acts. My goodness, we're on 26. There's only 28 chapters. We'll probably get it finished this year.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. My son-in-law said to me this morning, and I said, "Oh, I'm doing a bit of recording this afternoon." He says, "Wow, we're getting near the end of Acts." So, those that are following along will know we're nearly there. And of course, these final chapters, they're great big story narrative type stuff, but there's still some great detail that's worth leaning into. So it might go a bit faster. But knowing me and you, who knows what's going to happen over the next couple of sessions.
And then at some point soon, I think for all of you as listeners, we'll probably start to hint a little bit towards what we do next.
Yeah,
so, I don't know if we're open to votes on this or not, but maybe people could send in, "Hey, this is what we need."
Open to suggestions. As long as it's just a journey through the text, it's it's what we love. Yeah, I love it all. So yes, whatever direction we go in, whether we push further into the New Testament or maybe nudge into a really nice Tanakh conversation on something, that would be nice. But I'm up for anything. Yeah.
I love it. But we are still in Acts, and we're at verse 19 of chapter 26. So
come on,
Paul's mid-testimony. He's just sort of bringing it to an end here, and you're going to read verses 19 to 32 for us, just to round out chapter 26, aren't you?
Absolutely. And this is just magnificent stuff, really. I'm very excited to read this and can't wait to hear our reflections on it and what we want to share. But wow, what great stuff. So verse 19, Acts 26, Paul speaking, he says, "So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. First to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and all Judea, and then to the Gentiles. I preached that they should repent and turn to God and demonstrate their repentance by their deeds. That is why some Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But God has helped me to this very day. So I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer and, as the first to rise from the dead, would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles." At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You're out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane." "I am not insane, most excellent Festus," Paul replied. "What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it is not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do." Then Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Paul replied, "Short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains." The king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice, and those sitting with them. After they left the room, they began saying to one another, "This man is not doing anything that deserves death or punishment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar."
It doesn't stop being brilliant, does it?
It doesn't stop being brilliant. Yes.
Yeah. My goodness.
It's just the magnificence of both Paul's confidence in the story, and then even the little responses and interjections. They're loaded. They're powerful. It does you no matter how many times I've read this stuff, I am completely drawn into the drama of this
Yes.
moment. I mean, he's standing before a king, all right? It's a king with limited authority under the rule of Rome, but he's standing also before the representative of Rome and a lot of other very important people. And Paul, it's Paul's doing his thing. He's just like not intimidated, it seems, at all by that, and has a level of confidence both in the story and in the truth of that story, which causes him, even like at an audacious moment, even to refute the governor and push back on the governor's. I mean, that's pretty edgy stuff. Like a governor in the day of that world. I mean, he could have had you at the very least beaten around a little bit for that level of insolence. But Paul seems to have got his measure.
Yes, and I'm fascinated by the whole sequence of exchanges that are going on there. I'm struck, just to begin with, verse 19. So then, King Agrippa, I'm, and I've been interested in this throughout this very long series, which I've loved so much, about how Luke uses the narrative. Right?
Yeah.
So you've had Paul, and maybe I'm making too much of something here, John, but we've had Paul like screaming over the top of a crowd, right? We've had then Paul in front of, a council trying to defend himself. We've had Paul in the courts. And there's this, I don't know why, but there's this stunning notion that now in verse 19 of 26, I know there's other people in the room, but Paul is talking to one person. And do you feel that, do you feel that almost like the whole thing's been filtering down, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller?
Yeah.
And now it's Paul, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven.
Yeah.
I think the narrative of that is really powerful, the way this story's unfolding.
It is. It's so beautiful. And of course, what's fascinating is that in that gorgeous, I love that reflection, that gorgeous narrowing down. And now it's like Paul and Agrippa, even though people are in the room. Of course, you've had this constant running narrative with the Herodian or the Herod family all the way through the Jesus and X narrative, know. So we've had like Herod the Great, who in fact is the great grandfather here of Agrippa too. I mean, my goodness, he's introduced to the story in the most shocking way. This megalomaniac who has the children, the boys under two, destroyed in pursuit of Jesus. And then, of course, we meet other members of the Herod family, famously standing before Jesus stands before Herod Antipas and never speaks, doesn't speak a word just before his trial. And then, of course, you've got the Herod reaching out against the church and executing James within this. So we've seen this running thread of Herodian interaction, starting from something that feels deeply, deeply adversarial, right through to almost a reaction of curiosity, right through to sort of a reaction of fear. And now we've got this gorgeous intimacy. I love the way you framed that. And it sort of put me on that. I hadn't planned to say any of that. It's sort of that sense of, oh, wow, here's a Herod, here's a member of this family that has been adversarial up to this point against the gospel, Jesus and the church. And here, this man seems to be gripped, or at least very open or attentive to Paul. And Paul gets to speak in a way that no one seems to have got to speak to the Herodian family before. The closest I think we're getting to it is when John the Baptist is put in prison. I think there's a nuance within the gospel that though Herod put him in prison to kill him, there's a fear of him that kicks in, and then Herod ends up in sort of private conversations with John.
Yes, yeah.
And something's going on there, which the narrative doesn't give us any detail of. So here we've got this lovely, intimate feel with Agrippa and Bernice, of course, who's his half sister, hanging around. Just to put that into context, but I think that's lovely.
And it's interesting that you've got there's a tension. I don't want to jump straight to this tension, straight to the comments of this tension, but you've got Agrippa as the focus of the conversation. And then Luke sets us up, and we must talk about this, but let's hold it for now, that Festus interrupts with this, you're out of your mind. So there's this, Luke's even letting us see this tension between Agrippa's listening, and Agrippa is clearly interested in what's going on here. Festus is the one that just none of it's making sense. Like, you sound like a madman. But the thing that's fascinating to me, before we jump to that, if you're okay waiting to jump to that, is this, that Paul's speaking here, and he's drawing in the lack of resistance to, I mean, I don't want to say what Paul's not saying, but he's not a rebel. That's at some level what Paul's got going on here. That this looks like I'm a rebel. I'm being accused of being a rebel. I'm being accused of coming against the law, the prophets, and the empire. But actually, that's not my intention. That's not what I'm here to do. So I'm looking at some of his language, like, I preached to Damascus, Jerusalem, Judea, and Gentiles. I preached, and they should turn to God and demonstrate. God has helped me to this day. I'm here to testify to small and great. I'm not saying anything Moses and the prophets haven't said. There's a sequence of thought processes that he's showing Agrippa here, which is almost to say, like, the way that I'm being presented to you is not, that might be how people see me, but it's not my intention. And I don't want to repeat things we've said before, John, but I think this is so often the way it is, that the gospel is circumstantially opposed to the brokenness of the world. But the gospel's target is not the brokenness. The gospel's target is small and great alike being drawn to Jesus. Am I saying that clearly enough?
Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful. I think that really captures how Paul positions himself in the context of this, and of course the irony is that he's there under some form of accusation. He's been in prison at this point, or at least under some form of house arrest for over 2 years at this stage.
Yes.
So there's bound to be some sort of backstory floating around about this man, and yet he is nothing that he's been accused of being, and positions the gospel, though a radical message. I love his language. I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. He's clearly positioning his call and what he's living for in something greater than even the efforts of men. But it's all within terms of actually, I haven't circumvented, I haven't stepped outside of, I haven't broken the law. In fact, I've remained totally within the confines of the law in order to proclaim Christ. And he does it just in a masterful way, I think, in the context of that, using both the intimacy of his story. And I do think, and you do get the sense very, very quickly, that Paul senses that Agrippa is interested, that Agrippa is not like looking at an insect in a test tube, but that Agrippa is actually fascinated and interested in what Paul has to say. And even Paul's appeal to Agrippa, I think, sort of leans into all of that. So yeah, totally.
And I think, like, at a point, I think there's something in the human soul that always wants our enemies to be God's enemies too. And and therefore and I'm being facetious when I say this, but we sort of sometimes imagine God in heaven being like, oof, those Romans, I don't like those Romans, let's go get those Romans, right? Whereas what I love about what we see here in Paul is that the small and great alike matter to
Beautiful.
God.
Yeah,
And so
that.
God will always essentially draw people away from evil in all its forms. And if evil forms itself to us in the way of an individual or a whole empire, then that empire will feel itself on the dark side of God, for want of a better term. But the heart of God is that small and great alike are invited to come and return to him, right? To come home to him.
Beautiful.
And I think we, particularly even without getting into the weeds of politics, but particularly at this point in world history, we need to keep remembering that
For sure.
that God is calling everybody home. and so there's something really powerful in how that, I mean, thinking about that narrative arc of Paul here before Agrippa, with Jesus having been, so persecuted by Herod, John the Baptist persecuted by Herod. It really is quite remarkable. But at the same time, Agrippa's in a world which we'll see in just a moment that, the tension of his world makes his interest complex, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed. Indeed. And of course, there's a one other little sort of reflection which we've been tracking through the book of Acts, that the beautiful sort of fulfillment of various ideas of what the Lord has said to Paul is being enacted here in this moment. If we sort of go all the way back to Paul's call in Acts 9, that he was a chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. So he's standing here in front of representatives of both Roman and Jewish world, serious representatives, literally standing before a king here. All right, diminished authority. In many ways, some people would argue a puppet king under Rome, but a king nonetheless. And Festus himself feels that he wants or needs or looks for the affirmation or approval of Agrippa in terms of this man, Paul. So it's fascinating that we've got all of this, but Paul is literally fulfilling a prophetic word over his life. And again, I love this relentlessness through the book of Acts, that in the same way that, small and great are brought into the embracing arms of the gospel, Gentile, Jew, free and slave, male and female, the known and the unknown, the small and the great are brought into the sort of confines of the gospel. The other side of this is that in terms of his church, there is this remarkable ability that the Lord has of getting his people where he needs to get them to do what he needs them to do. And when Paul probably started his journey, he couldn't have imagined that he would be standing in places like this, doing what he is now doing for the power of the gospel.
I mean, the whole tension of what you're observing there seems to be present even in the story. You see this reaction from Festus, and I'm thinking about that narrowing that it narrows down to just King Agrippa, and he's a king. He's not rejected by God, right? God is inviting him to return, and as we'll see, King Agrippa picks up on that, right? And he's invited to return. Festus interrupts, but notice Paul's response. He sort of dismisses Festus. And in verse 26, the king is familiar with all these things, and I can speak freely to him. Like, he doesn't let the conversation be distracted. There's that intimacy of this conversation that's going on. Because I think genuinely in Paul's mind, this has now become... I don't want to be too manipulative with this, John, but it strikes me that this is a stunning pastoral moment because Paul actually has almost forgotten, can I say, that he's on trial. He hasn't, but I'm being creative, I suppose, with this imaginative. He's interested in Agrippa.
He is.
I think this is where the pastoral life is so stunning in Paul. And if we forget that Paul's a pastor, he's not some theorist or conceptualist, but he's actually somebody who cares about the individuals and the pastoral life. And this is where I don't want to be manipulative, but let me just say this anyway. The pastoral life will always fail if we start thinking about a crowd. Right?
Yeah.
This is why that question that gets asked so often of pastors and congregants, like, how many people come to your church now? Well, how many people is not a gospel question, right?
Yeah.
King Agrippa is a gospel question, right?
Yeah, yeah.
John
Yeah.
Andrews, David Harvey. The gospel always brings us down to the God that cares for us. Now,
Yeah.
not to leave us as individuals. That Western individualizing can be quite damaging to us as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that we are not simply nameless numbers that join a crowd. We are the individuals that God wants to bring into his family and then be his family. And now I'm possibly pushing it far too heavy in this pace here, but I do think there's a way of reading this that we see Paul's pastoral heart, that he's not being distracted from. I'm actually trying to talk to King Agrippa here about Jesus. And at very least, John, King Agrippa picks up on this.
He does. He does. No, it's an unmissable idea. In fact, if we track all the way back to verse 23 of 25, it says, the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and prominent men of the city. And then you've got Festus, of course, there and stuff as well. And Paul is brought in. Now, contrast that then to exactly the trajectory you've picked up on, which is absolutely gorgeous. Verse 27 of chapter 26. All the way here, it says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Even when I read it, I was quite emotional at Paul's very, very personal appeal. Do you believe the prophets? And then he adds, I know you do. I mean, that's quite, my goodness. Like that's not just Paul going, okay, let me just like knock this talk out of the park to this crowd of influential people. But Paul, dare we say it, dare we again over speculate, although it's maybe, solid speculation if there's such a thing. Is Paul looking straight at Agrippa when he says this, having been interrupted by Festus and almost pushed Festus to the side, which is incredibly courageous? Does he look straight at Agrippa? Does he cast a glance to Bernice when he asks the question, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Wow. And of course, it's interesting that then creates a fascinating reaction in Agrippa himself, but that you're absolutely right. I totally concur. If you look at the whole story from chapter 25 to this moment, it's almost like Paul has funneled this crowd down, and he's looking at one person, and he's seeking to influence that one person, and maybe by proxy influence the whole crowd, but by speaking to one in particular. I think there's something beautiful going on there, David. Absolutely correct.
And the Greek's actually really strong in it as well, because we get English translations, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. But the Greek, that response, I know you do, is I know that you believe. Right?
Yeah.
It's this is like the doubling of the use of that belief word makes us like it really. It's like Luke is reminding us and showing us in the narrative that belief is present here. Like this is not, this is not. And King Agrippa reacts to it. Like, do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? So he knows what's at stake in this conversation. This is no longer. I mean, it's so good. It's no longer. Let me say it like this: King Agrippa doesn't say, "Do you think you can get off with what you're accused in such a short time?" He doesn't, which is what is at some level actually what's going on here. But instead, I mean, this is the gorgeousness of Paul. Is that I think Agrippa's right. Paul has almost forgotten that he's on trial, and now he's actually back doing gospel work.
No, I absolutely love that. I think that is. I think Agrippa's response is the evidence that something deeply intimate, personal, and direct is happening here. He's not reading this as a man trying to get off an accusation. He's reading this as a man. He's trying to convert me. He's trying to get me to believe his stuff in the context. And isn't it interesting that whatever's going on in terms of the wider narrative of the church, Agrippa is able to distinguish the fact that this isn't simply a Jewish conversation. This is an ecclesia conversation. This is Paul's doing something else here. So it's interesting that Paul is appealing to Agrippa's understanding of Tanakh, understanding of Moses and prophets. He's already referenced those in his speech. He makes a direct appeal to Agrippa via the prophets within that. So Paul is making an appeal through the Jewishness of Agrippa's world and the understanding that Agrippa might have around the Hebrew scriptures. And yet Agrippa's response is striking in that we have employed this term Christian, this idea, hold on, are you trying to persuade me to join the way? Agrippa clearly knows the difference or the potential difference between the conversations here. He's not just saying, be a good believer of Tanakh. He's saying, no, this is about Jesus Christ. This is about the one who's changed my life. This is about the one, who has risen from the dead. And of course, it's at that point that Festus kicks in. Festus responds negatively about Paul being out of his mind to the suggestion of the resurrection. But Paul is relentless in pushing on sort of into that. So even for me, Agrippa's response shows the church, however we understand church, and the language of the way or the ecclesia, has now, that conversation is now in play in the courts of power. They are aware of ecclesia. They are aware of this cult, this community that Paul is now representing. So to me, again, all fascinating sort of layers to that. At a personal level, his own faith, but also at a bigger contextual level. My goodness, in such a short time, this community of faith has become, the powers to be are aware of it and aware of its distinctive nuances.
Well, this is this stunning little comment in verse 26. It's not done in a corner, right? It's
Indeed.
Not, this has not escaped his notice. And I think, what a lovely irony, John, right? That, and maybe I'm getting too carried away here, but this is as we're wont to do. But I was just thinking about the irony of, look at where this story started, right? And it's if you go all the way back to Luke, right? And I'm just looking at Luke chapter 1 right now as I'm saying this. The story begins with Zechariah standing at the. I mean, I'm please, John, pull me back from the brink here if you need to, right? But an angel of the Lord appears to Zechariah standing at the right side of the altar of incense, right? So let me be a little playful. Kind of does begin at a corner.
Yes.
It sort of does begin just off the recognized space. Not many people are in that space. I'm not trying to diminish the significance of the altar of incense, you understand.
No.
But nobody else is there, right? This is not a space that other people can be. And here's where the story starts, right? And then the next thing, we're in Nazareth, which, I mean, you've been there. It's off the beaten track.
It is.
Even multiple years later, knowing it's where Jesus was born, it still remains off the beaten track, doesn't it?
It does.
And now here we are coming towards the end of Acts, and we've gone to Jerusalem, Damascus, Samaria. We're heading towards Rome. It has not been done in a corner. I'm hanging a lot on a couple of words, but I'm not saying that even this is Luke's intention. I am just slightly overawed by the journey that this story has taken us on. From
sure.
us beginning at the corner of the altar of incense to now Paul, in all truth, being able to say, like, this hasn't just happened in a corner, Agrippa.
Yeah, no, completely. I love that. I really love that. And I think we may have reflected on this before, but the overall trajectory of the Lucan corpus, from beginning of the Gospel of Luke to eventually ending up in a house in Rome. I mean, that whole trajectory is about something that seems to start relatively small, personal, insignificant, and then enlarges into this glorious conversation that's starting to literally, yeast in the dough, literally infiltrate the Roman Empire. It's beginning to impact it, not in necessarily spectacular terms, but this community of faith is just relentlessly infiltrating itself into the Roman Empire, and Paul's confidence to stand before Roman authority, to stand before a king in Israel, and announce this and proclaim this, that he has amazing confidence in this gospel, in this good news, and clearly seems to be implying that Agrippa knows this. Agrippa is aware. Now, whether Agrippa is simply aware because he's got information out there and spies on the street and whatever, or is Agrippa aware of it because he's interested in it? And again, we don't want to overcook this, but the way Paul speaks to Agrippa seems to suggest more than just a sort of fascination with. Is Agrippa representative of something going on in the courts of power where people are aware and interested in more than a sort of a factual way, but sort of attracted and interested in what is actually happening? Is that what Paul is pushing at with Agrippa? And I think that's there, and I think that this is testimony to this incredible gospel that starts as a seed and becomes a tree, that starts as a bit of yeast and leavens the whole lump, that starts the corner of an altar and ends up in the courts of power, and eventually the court of Caesar himself.
So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now, so until next time, from John and I, goodbye.